Olivia Peterson, 34, stared at the champagne glass in her hand, watching bubbles rise and burst like the life she thought she had. Just 2 months ago, at what should have been a celebratory family dinner, her sister Amber had casually announced she was pregnant by Olivia's husband of 8 years. Today, as Olivia signed the final documents transferring ownership of their dream home to herself alone, she couldn't help but smile. They never suspected she'd discover the inheritance, the offshore accounts, or what truly happened the night their father died. Before I dive into how my entire world collapsed and how I rebuilt it from the ashes, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop your location in the comments below. If this story of family betrayal and sweet calculated justice resonates with you, hit that like button and subscribe to join our storytelling community. Trust me, you'll want to stick around to see how karma came full circle in this family revenge drama. Now let's get back to that fateful dinner. The Peterson name meant something in Boston's elite circles. My father, Richard Peterson, had built his investment firm from nothing into a financial powerhouse that managed billions. Growing up, I'd watched him work 18-hour days, teaching me that success required sacrifice and integrity. The Peterson name stands for trust, he'd say. I'd believed that with my whole heart. As the eldest daughter, I'd followed a path that made my father proud. I'd graduated top of my class from MIT's architecture program, built a successful firm specializing in sustainable design, and married James Harrington, my college sweetheart, who eventually became my father's right hand man at Peterson Investments. On paper, we were the perfect power couple, the architect and the financial wizard building our empire brick by brick. Our sprawling Victorian in Beacon Hill represented everything we'd worked for. James and I had restored it meticulously, preserving its historical features while adding modern comforts. It was meant to be our forever home, where we'd raise our children and grow old together. At least that had been the dream. Then there was my sister Amber. 5 years younger than me, she'd always been our father's favorite, though he'd never admit it. While I earned scholarships and worked internships, Amber drifted through life on her beauty and charm. She'd bounce between fashion merchandising jobs and influencer gigs, never quite finding her purpose, but always landing on her feet. Our relationship had always been complicated. I loved my sister fiercely, but her pattern of wanting what I had started young. My prom date, my college acceptance letter, my first design award, Amber had a way of making my milestones about her. I'd spent decades making excuses for her behavior, convincing myself that's what sisters do. Family came first, another lesson from our father that I'd internalized completely. After our mother died from breast cancer when I was 22, I'd stepped into the role of family peacekeeper. Sunday dinners at the family estate became sacred traditions I maintained, even when Amber would show up 3 hours late or not at all. "She's young," Dad would say. "She'll grow out of it." But at 39 and 59 respectively, we were all past the age where youth excused poor behavior. The last year had been especially challenging for James and me. After trying to conceive naturally for 3 years, we'd started fertility treatments. The hormone injections, the scheduled intimacy, the crushing disappointment each month, it had taken a toll on our relationship. James had been working later hours, traveling more frequently with my father to court international clients. I'd attributed his emotional distance to stress, to the pressure of trying to start a family while managing a growing portfolio of wealthy clients. When I'd finally seen those 2 pink lines on the pregnancy test 3 days before the family dinner, I'd wept with joy. After all our struggles, it felt like a miracle. I'd planned to tell James that night, but he'd texted that he was stuck in meetings. "Save it for the family dinner," he'd written. "Let's share our joy with everyone." I'd been touched by the sentiment, though, in retrospect, the words weren't in his usual texting style. The morning of the dinner, I'd spent hours preparing. Though we had staff at the family estate who could have handled everything, cooking had become my therapy during the fertility struggles. I'd made James's favorite bourbon-glazed salmon, prepared fresh pasta by hand, and baked a lemon tart from my mother's recipe. Dad had called twice to confirm the time. "I have some announcements tonight," he'd said, his voice unusually subdued. "Make sure everyone's there." I'd promised to corral Amber, which meant a series of increasingly firm text messages reminding her of her obligation. When Amber finally arrived at the estate, she'd been glowing in a way I hadn't seen before. Her designer dress showcased her perfect figure, her blonde hair falling in artful waves that had probably cost hundreds at her upscale salon. She'd hugged me with unusual warmth. "Tonight's going to change everything," she'd whispered, and I'd agreed, thinking of my own news tucked away for the perfect moment. James had arrived separately, claiming a late client meeting. When he'd walked in, his eyes had darted between Amber and me before he'd kissed my cheek, not my lips, as was our usual greeting. I'd noticed his freshly pressed suit, the expensive cologne he reserved for important client meetings, the nervous way he'd adjusted his tie. Looking back, the signs had been there all along. I'd just been too trusting to read them correctly. The dining room at the Peterson estate had always been imposing, crystal chandelier hanging over the antique mahogany table that seated 20, though we rarely filled more than 4 places. Family portraits spanning 5 generations looked down from dark-paneled walls, including the newest edition, my parents on their 25th anniversary. The last photograph taken before Mom's diagnosis. Dad sat at the head of the table as always. James and I took our usual places on one side, while Amber settled across from us, an enigmatic smile playing on her lips. The household staff had served the first course, my mother's recipe for lobster bisque, when Dad cleared his throat. "Before we get too far into dinner, I have an announcement," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had built his empire. "James has shown exceptional leadership in expanding our Asian markets. As of next quarter, he'll be named Chief Operating Officer of Peterson Investments." James nodded modestly, though I noticed he wouldn't meet my father's eyes. I reached for his hand under the table, genuinely proud, despite my own news burning in my chest. To James, Dad continued, raising his crystal glass. "The son I never had, but was fortunate enough to gain." We all lifted our glasses, mine filled with sparkling water rather than wine, a change I'd hoped someone would notice and question. No one did. "Actually," Amber interrupted, setting down her untouched wine, "I have an announcement too." Something in her tone made my stomach clench. The slight upward tilt of her chin, the challenging gleam in her eyes. I recognized her expression from childhood, whenever she was about to take something that was mine. "I'm pregnant," she announced, her hand moving to rest on her still flat stomach. For a moment, the statement hung in the air, incomplete and innocent. Dad's face broke into a smile. He'd been asking for grandchildren for years. I felt a complicated tangle of emotions, happiness for my sister, mixed with the disappointment of having my own thunder stolen yet again. "That's wonderful, honey," Dad began. "Who's the lucky James?" "Is the father," Amber cut in, her eyes locked on mine. The world stopped. Sound receded until all I could hear was my own heartbeat, thundering in my ears. I turned to James, waiting for his denial, for outrage, for any reaction that would make this cruel joke collapse. Instead, I saw guilt etched into every feature of his face. "Olivia," he began, his voice cracking. "I can explain. It wasn't what James," Amber interrupted. "Wasn't serious. Because it felt pretty serious all those nights you told me you were trapped in a marriage that couldn't give you what you wanted." My father slammed his fist down, crystal glasses jumping. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, looking between James and Amber. "Tell me, this is some sick joke." James looked physically ill. "Richard the First, it wasn't planned." Olivia and I were struggling. The pressure of the fertility treatments. "Don't you dare," I whispered, finding my voice at last. "Don't you dare blame this on our struggle to have a child. It's been going on for months," Amber continued, seeming to relish the destruction she was causing, "since before the fertility treatments. James came to me. He said he wasn't happy. And you, I turned to my sister, my voice eerily calm. You who has taken everything I've ever cared about since we were children. You thought this was acceptable. Amber shrugged, the gesture so casual it was almost comical against the backdrop of devastation. You couldn't give him children, Liv. I could. It's just biology. The room spun slightly. I'm pregnant, I said, the announcement dropping like a stone in still water. I found out 3 days ago. James paled further, if that was possible. What, congratulations, Sister Amber replied, without missing a beat. Seems we'll be raising cousins together. Though I wonder who the father of your baby really is, considering how little time James has spent at home. The accusation was so outrageous, so perfectly designed to cause maximum pain, that I couldn't form words to respond. My father stood pointing at James. You have betrayed this family in ways I cannot begin to articulate, he said, his voice dangerously low. But what's done is done. Amber is carrying my grandchild. I stared at my father, waiting for the rest, for his defense of me, for his outrage on my behalf. It never came. And what about my child? I asked quietly. An uncomfortable silence followed. We'll figure this out, Dad finally said, not meeting my eyes. The Peterson name has survived worse scandals. In that moment, I understood something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't just about James's betrayal or Amber's treachery. My father, the man who had taught me about integrity and family loyalty, was already calculating how to minimize damage to the family business, even if it meant sacrificing me. I stood slowly, placed my napkin beside my untouched plate, and walked toward the door. Olivia, James called after me, his voice pleading. Don't leave like this. We need to talk. I turned back one last time. No, James. You need to pack your things and be out of my house by morning. I drove home in perfect numb silence. Once inside my house, I methodically removed James's photographs from the mantel, placing them in a box by the door. I changed the sheets on our bed. I poured myself a glass of water and sat in the kitchen waiting for the tears that wouldn't come. Instead of grief, I felt something crystallizing inside me, a cold, clear purpose. I had been the good daughter, the loyal wife, the supportive sister my entire life. And in return, I had been betrayed by every person who should have protected me. As the shock began to recede, a different emotion took its place. Not the devastation they expected, the kind that would have me begging James to reconsider, pleading with Amber to end the pregnancy, imploring my father to take my side. Instead, I felt something much more dangerous: clarity. If they wanted war, I would give them war. But I would do it my way, methodically, intelligently, and without mercy. James moved out that night, taking only a suitcase of clothes and his laptop. I changed the security codes before his car had disappeared down the driveway. The next morning, I called in sick to my architecture firm for the first time in 7 years, and began methodically examining our life together. My training as an architect had taught me to be detail-oriented, to see systems rather than isolated components. I applied those same principles to understanding the betrayal that had exploded my life. In James's home office, beneath the false bottom of his desk drawer that he thought I didn't know about, I found a burner phone. The text messages between him and Amber dated back 14 months, long before our fertility struggles had begun in earnest. I photographed everything, creating digital and physical backups. She's working late again, one message from James read. Meet me at the usual place. Daddy's asking questions about the Singapore accounts, read another. Distract him at dinner tomorrow. Singapore accounts. My father had never mentioned Singapore investments to me. I hired Patricia Winters, the most ruthless divorce attorney in Boston. They expect you to fall apart, she said during our first meeting. That's when they'll try to push through a settlement that leaves you with crumbs. Don't give them the satisfaction. Next came the private investigator, a former FBI forensic accountant who specialized in financial crimes. Follow the money, I instructed him. I don't care what it costs. Within a week, he delivered his preliminary findings. James had been siphoning client funds into offshore accounts for at least 3 years. My father's signature appeared on some of the transfers, but others bore only James's authorization. The pattern suggests your husband started small, possibly with your father's knowledge, then escalated significantly in the past 18 months, the investigator explained. There's a particular account in Singapore that's received over $20 million. The beneficial owner is listed as a shell corporation, but the formation documents name your sister as the director. I thought back to Amber's sudden shopping sprees, her new penthouse apartment that she'd claimed was a steal, the luxury vacations she'd taken on what she'd called influencer partnerships. It had all been funded by stolen money, money taken from clients who trusted the Peterson name. What about my father? I asked. How involved is he? The investigator hesitated. The evidence suggests he was aware of some irregular activities but may not have known the full extent. There's something else. His medical records show treatments for what was diagnosed as an unusual heart condition, beginning 8 months ago. The symptoms are consistent with certain types of poisoning. I felt the blood drain from my face. Are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything yet, he replied cautiously. But the timing coincides with your husband's most aggressive fund transfers. And your father's will would be relevant in this situation. My father had always been intensely private about his estate planning. All I knew was that the family business would be taken care of upon his death. I'd never pushed for details, trusting that he had everything in order. That afternoon, I visited my father's personal attorney, an ancient man who had been with the family since before I was born. Olivia, he greeted me, surprise evident in his rheumy eyes. I didn't expect to see you. My condolences on your domestic situation. Thank you, Mr. Abernathy. I need information about my father's will. The old man shifted uncomfortably. You know I can't discuss that while your father is alive. I think my husband may be slowly poisoning my father to gain control of the company, I said bluntly. And I believe my sister is involved. Abernathy's face went slack with shock. Then something like recognition flickered in his eyes. Your father came to see me last month, he said slowly. He wanted to make changes to his estate plan. He seemed concerned. What kind of changes? I can't tell you specifics. But I can tell you he asked a lot of questions about the process for removing an executor and beneficiary in case of his words a betrayal of fiduciary duty. That night I accidentally encountered my father's oldest friend and former business partner William Hargrove at his regular table at the Oak Room. William had been pushed out of the firm 5 years earlier under circumstances that had never been fully explained to me. After an hour of careful conversation and 2 scotches, William leaned forward. I've been waiting for someone in your family to start asking questions, he said. I tried to warn your father about James 3 years ago. Found some discrepancies in the European accounts. Next thing I knew, I was being accused of the very thing I'd discovered, and shown the door with a settlement agreement that included a strict non-disclosure clause. Why are you telling me this now? William's eyes still sharp despite his 70 years met mine. Because Richard called me last week, said he needed to meet, that he'd made a terrible mistake. We were supposed to have dinner tomorrow. 3 days later, I found the key. It was in my mother's jewelry box, a safe deposit box key I'd never seen before. The box contained documents my father had clearly meant for me to find a revised will, leaving controlling interest in Peterson Investments to me, not James. Evidence of the embezzlement with notes in my father's handwriting, marking which transactions had been legitimate and which were unauthorized. And a letter. Olivia, it began. If you're reading this, something has happened to me before I could make things right. I've been a fool. James and Amber. The letter ended abruptly, as if he'd been interrupted while writing it. The most damning evidence came 2 weeks later when the private investigator obtained records showing James had been purchasing small amounts of thallium, a tasteless, odorless poison once called the poisoner's poison because symptoms mimic so many natural ailments. The purchases aligned perfectly with my father's declining health. I was building my case methodically, preparing for the moment I would bring everything crashing down, when I overheard a conversation between Amber and James at the hospital, where my father was undergoing cardiac testing. "Once the old man is gone and the divorce is final, we'll have everything," James was saying. "The house, the company, the accounts, all of it." "What about the baby?" Amber asked. There was a pause before James replied, "There is no baby, Amber. There never was. We needed that story to break them apart, and it worked. Olivia's already agreed to a quick divorce. She's so destroyed she's not even asking questions about the finances." I slipped away before they could spot me, a new piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Amber had lied about the pregnancy, a lie designed to devastate me so completely that I wouldn't fight for what was mine. They'd underestimated me catastrophically. I continued gathering evidence, building my case piece by piece. I appeared appropriately broken during brief encounters with James or my father, who was now using a wheelchair and whose once sharp mind seemed increasingly clouded. I agreed to preliminary divorce terms that James' lawyer presented, nodding meekly. As they explained, I would receive a generous settlement that amounted to less than 10% of our actual assets. All the while I was preparing for war. William Hargrove's office was in a converted brownstone far from the gleaming Peterson investment headquarters downtown. As I settled into the worn leather chair across from his desk, I felt a strange calm descend. I was about to learn the final pieces of a puzzle I'd been assembling for weeks. "Your father and I built Peterson Investments on a simple principle." William began, pouring us each a measure of scotch despite the early hour. "Client trust is sacred. For the first 20 years we never strayed from that path." He swirled the amber liquid, his eyes distant. "Then came the financial crisis of '08. We were extended too far in certain markets. Richard wanted to use client funds to cover losses temporarily, just until things stabilized. I refused. We argued. In the end, I thought I'd convinced him to find another way. But he didn't," I said quietly. William's sad smile confirmed my suspicion. "No, he found another way, all right. He found James fresh out of business school, brilliant with numbers, and absolutely amoral when it came to financial regulations. My father was breaking the law. Despite everything I'd discovered, this was still difficult to accept. Not at first. James started with aggressive but legal strategies. Your father was impressed. James Rose quickly married you, which gave him the ultimate credential of being a Peterson by marriage, and then slowly began introducing increasingly questionable practices. And my father went along with it." William nodded grimly. "By the time I realized what was happening, they had already marginalized me. When I confronted them with evidence, they turned it around on me. Classic gaslighting. Made me doubt what I'd seen with my own eyes." He pulled out a thick file from his desk drawer. "I've kept records of everything. I may have signed an NDA, but that doesn't apply if there's criminal activity." He slid the file across to me. "When your father called last week, he said he needed to make things right. Said he'd been reviewing old transactions and had found something disturbing. I think James realized your father was catching on. I thought of my father's mysterious health decline, the thallium purchases. They've been poisoning him," I said flatly. William didn't look surprised. I suspected as much. Richard was always healthy as a horse. This sudden heart condition never made sense. Why didn't he go to the authorities? Pride, maybe. Or shame. Or perhaps he was protecting Amber. You know how blind he's always been when it comes to her. William leaned forward. "But here's what you need to know, Olivia. Your father amended his will last month. I was there as a witness. He left controlling interest in the firm to you, not James. And he included a letter detailing his suspicions about certain financial irregularities. I felt a surge of vindication. That's why they needed me out of the way. They knew I'd inherit control, not them. Exactly. The pregnancy announcement, the quick divorce, it was all designed to destabilize you emotionally, so you wouldn't look too closely at the settlement terms, which would have required you to relinquish your inheritance rights. Armed with William's documentation, I met with a forensic accountant who specialized in financial crimes. For 6 hours we traced the money trail through dozens of accounts, shell companies and phony investment vehicles. They've stolen approximately $47 million over the past 5 years, she concluded, some from the firm itself but most from client accounts. They've covered it with false statements and fabricated returns. Can it be proven in court? She nodded confidently. Oh yes. Once someone knows where to look, the evidence is overwhelming. They got sloppy as they got greedier. That night I visited my father in the hospital. He looked diminished in the hospital bed, his once commanding presence reduced to a frail old man attached to monitoring equipment. I wondered how much he knew, how complicit he truly was in what James had done. Olivia, he said weakly when he saw me, I've been asking for you. I've been busy, Dad. I kept my voice neutral, still uncertain whether he had been victim or collaborator. I need to tell you something. He motioned for me to come closer. About James. About the company. I know, Dad. I know about the embezzlement, the offshore accounts. I know about all of it. Surprise and then relief washed over his features. Then you understand why I changed the will. Why, you need to take control. What about Amber? I asked, watching his reaction carefully. Pain flickered across his face. Amber is. He hesitated. I've protected her too much. Given her too much without expecting responsibility in return. I thought James would be a stabilizing influence on her, never imagining. He didn't finish the thought, but I understood. My father had been manipulated just as I had been. I think they're poisoning you, I said softly. He didn't look surprised. I suspected as much. The symptoms matched something I read about. That's why I've been refusing food they bring, insisting on hospital meals only. Why haven't you told the doctors? He looked away. Because I'm ashamed, Olivia. I let this happen. I brought James into our family, into our business. I chose to believe Amber's lies because the truth was too painful. I failed you. For the first time I saw my father as fully human, flawed, foolish in some ways, but not the villain I'd feared he might be. I took his hand, feeling its papery thinness, the prominent veins mapping a life I'd never fully understood. We'll fix this, I promised. Back at home, I gathered every piece of evidence into a comprehensive file: financial records, medical reports, text messages, emails, and witness statements. I made copies, storing them in multiple secure locations. Then I contacted my father's lawyer, my divorce attorney, and a criminal prosecutor I'd dated briefly in law school. James and Amber had grown increasingly confident as the days passed. They'd started house hunting, looking at properties even more extravagant than the one James and I had shared. Amber had been photographed shopping for designer maternity clothes, maintaining her pregnancy facade. James had taken to calling me about expediting the divorce proceedings, his voice holding a barely concealed triumph. Little did they know that in less than 24 hours I would destroy everything they'd built on betrayal and lies. Hey everyone, I know we're at a pivotal moment in the story, and I can literally feel your shock and anticipation through the screen. Before I continue with what happened during the confrontation, drop a different in the comments if you're as fired up as I was about getting justice. This family drama is about to reach its boiling point, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. If you're enjoying this story of betrayal and sweet revenge, hit that like button, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the explosive conclusion. Now let's get back to how I finally confronted my husband and sister. I chose the Peterson Investment Conference Room for our meeting, the same room where my father had built his empire, where James had been welcomed into the fold, where countless deals had been sealed with handshakes backed by the Peterson name and reputation. My father, against medical advice, insisted on attending. He arrived in a wheelchair, looking frail but with a determination in his eyes I recognized from my childhood. Patricia Winters, my divorce attorney, sat to my right. The firm's general counsel and a forensic accountant completed our side of the table. I had instructed my assistant to tell James the meeting concerned routine divorce settlement matters. He arrived precisely at 10, confidence evident in his stride, Amber trailing behind him like she already owned the place. The shock on their faces when they saw the assembled group was the first satisfaction I'd felt in weeks. "What is this?" James demanded, his hand automatically straightening his tie, a nervous gesture I'd noticed throughout our marriage. "Please sit," I said, gesturing to the chairs across from us. "We have a lot to discuss." "If this is some attempt to delay the divorce," Amber began, her hand resting performatively on her non-existent pregnant belly. "This isn't about delaying anything," I interrupted calmly. "This is about accountability." My father wheeled himself forward slightly. "Sit down," he commanded, his voice still carrying the authority that had built his empire. They sat, exchanging nervous glances. James attempted a reassuring smile. "Richard, you should be resting. I'm sure whatever this is can be handled without troubling you." I opened the leather portfolio in front of me and removed the first document, a comprehensive analysis of the Singapore accounts. "Let's begin with the $47 million you've embezzled from client accounts over the past 5 years," I said, sliding the document across the table. James barely glanced at it. "I don't know what you're talking about. This meeting is inappropriate. My lawyer should be present." "Your lawyer has been contacted," Patricia interjected. "He's chosen not to attend after reviewing preliminary evidence we provided." That caught James off guard. His lawyer, a shark known for defending white-collar criminals, had apparently recognized a losing battle. I continued, methodically laying out document after document. Bank transfers, falsified client statements, recordings of James reassuring worried investors while simultaneously draining their accounts. "This is absurd," Amber sputtered, her facade cracking. "James would never." "Actually, Amber, we have substantial evidence of your involvement too," I said, producing copies of the Shell Corporation documents bearing her signature. "Setting up a shell company in the Caymans requires personal appearance and identification. Did you think that wouldn't leave a trail?" James's face had drained of color. "This can be explained," he said weakly. "Some aggressive but legal tax strategies perhaps misunderstood." "And this?" I asked, placing medical reports on the table. "Can you explain the thallium found in my father's hair analysis? The same compound traced to purchases made with your personal credit card." The room fell silent. Even Amber seemed shocked by this, her eyes darting to James questioningly. "You told me the heart medication was making him confused," she whispered. "You said we just needed to get control of the company before he made reckless decisions." James glared at her. "Shut up, Amber." My father leaned forward. "I trusted you, son, brought you into my family. And this is how you repay that trust. You were going to change everything." James snapped, his composure finally breaking. "Giving control to Olivia, who knows nothing about running an investment firm. Everything I did was to protect the company." "By stealing from our clients?" I asked incredulously. "By poisoning my father? By faking a pregnancy to devastate me?" Amber's head whipped toward me. "How did you?" "Oh, I heard you both at the hospital," I replied. "Quite the performance, Amber. Though I notice your baby bump hasn't progressed much in 2 months." The general counsel cleared his throat. "We have more than enough evidence for criminal charges. Securities fraud, attempted murder, conspiracy. The penalties would be substantial." "You wouldn't," James said, looking at my father. "The scandal would destroy Peterson Investments." Everything you've built would collapse overnight. My father met his gaze steadily. I should have done this years ago when I first suspected you were cutting corners. My reputation is not worth protecting criminals, even if they're family. There is an alternative, I said, removing a final set of documents from my portfolio. Conditional on your full cooperation and confession. James and Amber leaned forward, desperation evident in their postures. Complete dissolution of your marriage to me, James. You walk away with nothing, no alimony, no property division, no claims on future earnings. Amber forfeits all Peterson family assets, including her trust fund. Both of you resign from the company immediately and agree never to work in financial services again. And you leave Boston. Permanently. That's everything we have, Amber protested. You can't expect us to just. It's that or prison, Patricia cut in bluntly. Securities fraud carries up to 20 years. Attempted murder carries a life sentence in Massachusetts. And before you think this is an empty threat, I added, the SEC has already received an anonymous tip with sufficient details to begin an investigation. We've simply been granted a 48-hour courtesy window before they move formally. James's shoulders sagged as the full weight of his situation settled on him. What about the clients, the ones whose funds were? We're prepared to make them whole, my father said. I'll sell personal assets if necessary. The Peterson name will stand for integrity again, even if it ruins me financially. James looked at Amber, who was staring at the table, tears streaming down her face. The invincible facade had finally cracked completely. We don't have a choice, do we? James asked. You always had choices, I replied. Every step of the way, you chose betrayal. Now you're facing the consequences. 6 hours later, after lawyers had drafted and revised every detail, James and Amber signed the agreements. No criminal charges would be filed, provided they adhered to every condition. They would retain only enough assets to relocate and establish modest new lives far from Boston. Any violation would trigger immediate reporting to authorities. As they stood to leave, Amber paused at the door. I am sorry, Liv, she said quietly. Not that it matters now. I didn't respond. Some betrayals go beyond forgiveness. James couldn't even look at me as he left. The man I had loved, built a life with and trusted completely, simply walked away without a word. It should have hurt. Instead, I felt nothing but relief as the door closed behind them. My father reached for my hand. I've failed you in so many ways, he said. I squeezed his fingers gently. We're going to fix everything, Dad. Together. And in that moment I knew we would. The divorce was finalized in record time, with judges expediting proceedings once they understood the circumstances. I received the house, all joint assets, and a complete severance from James's mounting legal troubles. My father began treatment for thallium poisoning, slowly regaining his strength as the toxin was cleared from his system. James and Amber moved to Phoenix, as far from Boston's winters and social circles as they could manage. Through mutual connections, I learned they'd rented a modest apartment in a nondescript suburban complex, a far cry from the luxurious homes they'd once enjoyed. Within Peterson Investments, my father and I worked with a specialized team to identify every instance of fraud and make all clients whole. We sold personal assets, liquidated investment properties, and borrowed against the firm's future earnings to ensure not a single client lost money due to James's actions. The process was painful and humbling, but necessary to restore the integrity of the Peterson name. Professionally, James found himself radioactively unemployable. Though we hadn't pressed criminal charges, the financial industry's gossip network ensured his reputation was irreparably damaged. Every background check revealed his sudden departure from Peterson Investments under suspicious circumstances. Job offers were extended, then mysteriously withdrawn. Consulting contracts dried up before they began. Amber's carefully curated social media presence began to unravel. Her pregnancy mysteriously disappeared without explanation. Her lifestyle content, once showcasing luxury products in opulent settings, shifted awkwardly to budget-friendly finds in their sparse apartment. Her follower count dropped precipitously, as she could no longer maintain the aspirational facade that had been her brand. 3 weeks after they left Boston, I received a panicked call from Amber. "We need money," she said, without preamble. "The apartment wants first, last, and security. It's coming to $12,000, and the accounts are frozen." "That sounds like a personal problem," I replied calmly. "The agreement stipulated you'd receive living expenses for 60 days. How you manage that money is entirely your concern." "James spent it," she admitted, her voice small, "on a lawyer who says we might have grounds to challenge the agreement." I allowed myself a small smile. "Did the lawyer take a retainer before telling you there's no case?" Her silence was answer enough. "That was unwise," I observed. "Perhaps James hasn't learned his lesson about due diligence yet." "Olivia, please. I'm your sister." "You stopped being my sister the moment you announced you were pregnant with my husband's child," I replied. "A pregnancy that never existed, by the way." "I made a terrible mistake," she whispered. "We both did." "Yes," I agreed. "And now you're living with the consequences. Goodbye, Amber." I ended the call, blocked her number, and instructed my assistant to do the same. Through methodical planning, I ensured their social isolation extended beyond financial hardship. I hadn't anticipated sending anonymous letters to their new neighbors and colleagues. I wasn't cruel by nature, but when a mutual friend forwarded me messages from Amber claiming I had stolen her inheritance through manipulation, I decided corrective action was warranted. I sent carefully worded emails to their new employers, neighbors, and social connections, not detailing specific crimes, but noting their departure under difficult ethical circumstances. I attached no evidence, made no accusations, but planted just enough doubt to ensure they couldn't rebuild their social capital. Within 6 weeks of leaving Boston, James and Amber's relationship had deteriorated dramatically. Without wealth and status to bind them, the foundation of their connection crumbled. Mutual friends reported increasingly public arguments. Amber's social media posts shifted from aspirational couple content to vague references about toxic relationships and learning to stand alone. When James attempted to contact my father directly, pleading for a reference or connection to help him find employment, my father's response was characteristically brief: "You made your choices, live with them." By day 52, they were living separately. Amber had moved in with distant relatives in Scottsdale, while James had taken a room in a shared house with 3 roommates, working as a barback at a struggling sports bar, the only job he could secure without references. My private investigator confirmed what the settlement agreement required: total financial collapse within the 60-day monitoring period. Their joint checking account showed a balance of $17.43. James's once impressive investment portfolio had been liquidated entirely for living expenses. Amber's credit cards had been declined at increasingly modest establishments. They had lost everything: reputation, relationship, financial security, social standing, just as I had lost everything 2 months earlier. The difference was I had rebuilt from the ashes. They had simply burned. Was it vindictive to monitor their downfall so closely? Perhaps. But after a lifetime of being the responsible one, the one who forgave and accommodated and made peace, I allowed myself this one indulgence: witnessing justice unfold in real time. The most unexpected outcome was my father's transformation. Nearly dying had forced him to reconsider his priorities. He stepped back from daily management of the firm, focusing instead on mentoring the next generation of financial advisors with a renewed emphasis on ethics. He made amends with William Hargrove, bringing him back as a special advisor to help restructure the company. "I've made so many mistakes," he told me over dinner one night at the estate, favoring Amber, trusting James blindly, taking shortcuts that compromised our integrity. "I want whatever time I have left to count for something better." I reached across the table and took his hand. It already is. Together, we rebuilt Peterson Investments into something stronger, more transparent, and genuinely ethical. My architectural background proved surprisingly relevant as we reconstructed the firm's foundation. I took on a leadership role I'd never anticipated, discovering an aptitude for finance that perhaps had always been in my blood. As the 60-day mark approached, I received one final message from James, an email that somehow slipped through my filters. "I know you'll never forgive me," he wrote. I wouldn't forgive me either. But I need you to know that losing you, not the money, not the status, but you, is the punishment I deserve most. I destroyed the only real thing in my life for an illusion of something more. There's no justice that could be more perfect than living with that knowledge every day for the rest of my life. I didn't respond. Some closure requires no further comment. Exactly 60 days after that devastating dinner, I sat in my attorney's office signing the final documents that formally transferred full ownership of our Boston home solely to me. The last legal tie between James and me was severed cleanly, precisely, and irrevocably. Justice, I had discovered, wasn't about making others suffer as I had suffered. It was about restoring balance, about ensuring consequences matched actions, about rebuilding what had been destroyed, but stronger, wiser, and free from the weaknesses that had allowed the destruction in the first place. As I raised a glass of champagne that evening, watching bubbles rise and burst, I felt no triumph or vindication, only peace. They had lost everything they had valued. And in losing everything I thought I had valued, I had found something more authentic and enduring: myself. 6 months after that fateful dinner, I barely recognized my life or myself. The home James and I had shared had been completely transformed. I'd torn out walls, replaced the dark mahogany finishes he'd preferred with light oak and crisp whites, converted his cavernous home office into a sunlit studio where I worked on designs for a new kind of architecture. I was exploring structures designed for healing, for community, for reconnection. Peterson Investments had undergone an equally dramatic metamorphosis. My father had officially named me CEO 3 months earlier, though he remained as chairman of the board, his health improving steadily under proper treatment. We'd implemented transparency measures that exceeded industry standards, invited regulatory oversight that our competitors avoided, and established an ethics committee with real authority to question any transaction. The most surprising development came from an unexpected quarter. Federal investigators had appeared at my office one morning, presenting subpoenas for documents related to James's tenure at the firm. "We've received information about potential securities fraud," the lead investigator explained. "Very specific information. I'd anticipated this possibility. Though we hadn't reported James and Amber to authorities, others who'd suffered from their actions might have made connections once the dust settled. We'll cooperate fully," I assured them. "My only request is that we protect innocent employees and clients from unnecessary exposure." The investigator had studied me with unexpected sympathy. "Miss Peterson, our target isn't your family or your firm. Based on the evidence we've already gathered, it appears your husband and sister were part of a larger network of financial fraud. We believe they were relatively minor players in something much bigger." That revelation had launched weeks of careful cooperation with federal authorities. I provided evidence while they shared disturbing connections. James had been involved with several other investment advisors who'd been systematically defrauding clients across multiple firms. My father, it seemed, had been partially correct. James had indeed been trying to protect the firm, but only to conceal his participation in a wider criminal enterprise. When the case finally broke in the financial press, Peterson Investments was praised for its cooperation and ethical handling of a difficult situation. The $47 million James had stolen seemed almost modest compared to the billions the entire network had embezzled over a decade. Through it all, I maintained a careful balance, providing authorities what they needed, while protecting the reformed firm and its employees. My father watched with evident pride as I navigated these treacherous waters. "You were always the strongest of us," he told me one evening, as we reviewed quarterly reports. "I just never gave you the chance to show it." Amber and James featured in the federal indictments, though their roles were deemed minor enough that their plea agreements resulted in probation rather than prison time, conditional on their continued cooperation with investigators, targeting bigger fish. Their names appeared in brief mentions, deep in financial news articles, forgotten footnotes in a larger scandal. I received a letter from Amber 6 months into her probation. It was 10 pages long, filled with explanations, justifications, and finally, in the last paragraph, something approaching genuine remorse. "I've spent my entire life in your shadow," she wrote. "Everything came so easily to you: Dad's approval, academic success, career achievements. I wanted to take something from you to prove I could. I never stopped to consider what I was destroying, not just your life, but my own. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope someday you might find peace." I considered not responding. The damage she'd caused couldn't be undone with words, no matter how seemingly sincere. But after meditation and therapy had helped me process my own trauma, I sent a brief reply. "Amber, I hope you find the help you need to understand why you made these choices. We cannot be sisters again, but I don't wish suffering upon you. Find your own path, not defined by taking from others or comparing yourself to me. That's the only advice I can offer." It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was a release for both of us. As for my personal life, I had expected to remain closed off, focused entirely on rebuilding my professional world. Instead, I found unexpected connection with Michael Hargrove, William's son, who had joined the ethics committee at the firm. He'd been divorced for 3 years, was raising a teenage daughter, and approached relationships with the same careful thoroughness I now valued. Our first dinner had been strictly professional, discussing compliance frameworks. The second had ventured into personal territory, shared experiences of betrayal, the challenge of rebuilding trust. By the third dinner, we'd acknowledged the growing attraction between us, but agreed to move forward with intentional slowness. No rushing, no grand promises, just honest communication and gradual building of trust. 8 months after that devastating dinner announcement, I found myself in the doctor's office, receiving surprising news of my own. The pregnancy I'd announced that night had ended in an early miscarriage, stress and trauma taking their toll. But now, with my life recalibrated and my body recovered, I was pregnant again. I shared the news with my small circle of trusted friends, first the chosen family I'd gathered around me during Reconstruction. Their joy was uncontaminated by history or ulterior motives. My father wept when I told him, promising to be the grandfather this child deserved. Michael was the last to know, not because he was least important, but because I needed to be certain of my own feelings before involving him in such a life-altering development. His response was characteristically thoughtful. "This is your child, Olivia. I have no expectations or demands. But I would be honored to support you however you wish, whether as a friend, a partner, or something more if that's what we both come to want." His respect for my autonomy, for my right to make decisions without pressure or manipulation, confirmed what I'd begun to feel: this was a man worth trusting, worth allowing into the fortress I'd built around my heart. 1 year to the day after Amber's pregnancy announcement, I hosted a dinner at the Peterson estate. The guest list was small: my father, William Hargrove, Michael and his daughter Emily, and a few close friends who had stood by me through everything. The dining room had been redecorated, the oppressive dark paneling replaced with warm colors, the austere family portraits exchanged for vibrant art from local creators. As we raised our glasses in toast, I felt the symmetry of the moment: same room, same ritual, but everything transformed. Where there had been betrayal, now there was loyalty. Where there had been deception, now there was transparency. Where there had been conditional love, now there was acceptance without agenda. To new beginnings, my father offered his voice strong again. To chosen family, I added, looking around at the faces of those who had earned their places at my table. Later that night, as the guests departed and I stood on the front steps watching taillights disappear down the long driveway, Michael joined me. "Happy?" he asked, simply. I considered the question with the thoroughness it deserved. "Content," I answered finally. "Whole in a way I never was before, even when I thought my life was perfect. The betrayal that should have destroyed me had instead burned away everything inauthentic, leaving behind something stronger and more genuine than I'd ever known. In losing what I thought was my whole world, I had found a universe of possibilities I'd never imagined." As for James and Amber, they had indeed lost everything within those 60 days. But in truth, they had lost the most important things long before: integrity, authenticity, the capacity for genuine connection. Their external collapse had merely reflected an internal bankruptcy that had existed all along. I placed a protective hand over my growing belly, feeling the slight flutter of movement. "My child, my future, my new beginning. Justice isn't always about winning or losing," I said softly. "Sometimes it's about restoration. About things finding their proper places. Sometimes the most devastating moment of your life becomes the doorway to your most authentic self. And sometimes 60 days is exactly how long it takes for karma to complete its perfect circle." And that's where my story rests today, not in triumph over those who wronged me, but in the peace of building something true from the ashes of what was false. That's the real victory. That's the justice I never knew I needed. Hey everyone, if you've made it to the end of my story, I'd love to know, have you ever witnessed karma come full circle in your own life or someone else's? Drop a comment below and share your experiences with family betrayal, sweet justice moments. This journey taught me so much about resilience and rebuilding. If it resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories like this one. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that sometimes our biggest breakdowns lead to our most important breakthroughs. Thank you for being part of my healing by listening, and remember, the best revenge isn't getting even, it's living well. See you in the next story.